The razor blade scraped against Captain Klaus Weber's weathered jaw, each stroke accompanied by the sting of cold water and the dull edge that had served him for 3 months in this God-forsaken American prisoner-of-war camp. The morning ritual had become a meditation of sorts, a way to maintain some semblance of dignity in a place designed to strip it away. Weber stood before a cracked mirror propped against the wooden barracks wall, his reflection showing a man aged beyond his 34 years by war and captivity. The compound stretched around him like a grid of despair, rows of identical wooden huts surrounded by double fences topped with barbed wire, guard towers positioned at precise intervals like chess pieces on a board of human misery. The Oklahoma soil beneath his feet was red clay that turned to mud with the slightest moisture, clinging to everything and staining the prisoners' uniforms a permanent rust color. Weber had commanded U-boat 347 through the treacherous waters of the North Atlantic until that terrible day when Allied depth charges had torn his submarine apart, sending most of his crew to the ocean floor while he and 7 others were pulled from the freezing water more dead than alive. "Another beautiful morning in paradise," muttered Sergeant Heinrich Richter, Weber's former torpedo man, as he emerged from the barracks behind him. Richter's face bore the same rough stubble that marked all the German prisoners, a testament to their shared struggle with inadequate shaving supplies and cold water that made the daily routine an exercise in endurance rather than grooming. Weber was about to respond when a sound cut through the morning air that made him freeze, the razor halfway across his cheek. It was a buzzing, electric hum that seemed to come from the guard tower 50 meters away. Not the familiar sounds of war they had grown accustomed to, not the rumble of trucks or the mechanical clicking of rifles being cleaned, but something entirely foreign and impossible. "Do you hear that?" Weber whispered, his voice barely audible above the strange noise. Richter cocked his head, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the sound. Around them, other prisoners had begun to emerge from their barracks for the morning routine, but one by one they stopped, their conversations dying away as the peculiar buzzing continued. The sound was steady, mechanical, yet somehow intimate, like an insect trapped in a jar, but with a purpose that eluded understanding. Weber lowered his razor, forgotten water droplets falling from his half-shaved face to the dusty ground. His heart began to pound with a mixture of curiosity and dread as he realized the sound was coming from the American guard station. Through the chain-link fence he could see movement in the tower, a shadow passing back and forth across the small window. "That's not possible," Richter breathed, his voice carrying the same confusion that Weber felt growing in his chest. The door to the guard station opened with a metallic creak that seemed unnaturally loud in the morning stillness. Private Tommy Rodriguez stepped out onto the small platform, and Weber felt his world tilt on its axis. The young American soldier, who couldn't have been more than 20 years old, had a face as smooth and clean-shaven as a baby's. In his right hand, he held a small metal device that continued to emit the mysterious buzzing sound. Weber's jaw dropped, the razor slipping from his fingers to clatter against the ground. Around him, he could hear the sharp intakes of breath from his fellow prisoners as they pressed against the fence, their eyes wide with disbelief and something approaching reverence. "Mein Gott," whispered Obergefreiter Franz Müller, a former tank operator whose own face was covered in nearly 2 weeks of stubble. "What is that thing?" Rodriguez seemed oblivious to the attention he had garnered. He moved the device across his jaw with practiced ease, the buzzing growing louder as it worked. There was no water, no soap, no careful preparation, just the machine and the smooth skin it left in its wake. The American's casual demeanor spoke of routine, of a technology so commonplace that he gave it no more thought than breathing. Weber's mind raced as he watched the impossible scene unfold. Back home in Bremen, his wife Greta still heated water on their wood-burning stove every morning, a ritual that had remained unchanged since before the war. His father, a veteran of the Great War, continued to use the same straight razor he had carried through the trenches of France, carefully maintaining its edge with a leather strop that had belonged to Weber's grandfather. "This cannot be real," Weber said aloud, his voice carrying across the silent compound. "Americans are supposed to be weak, unprepared. That's what Berlin told us." The words felt hollow even as he spoke them. For months, the German prisoners had clung to the propaganda they had been fed throughout the war. Stories of American softness, of a nation of city dwellers who couldn't fight a real war, of an industrial base built on luxury rather than military might. Their officers had painted pictures of American soldiers as poorly equipped and unprepared, stumbling through battles with outdated equipment and no real understanding of warfare. But here, in this muddy field camp in the middle of Oklahoma, a 20-year-old American boy was using electricity to shave his face with the casual ease of someone who had never known scarcity or technological limitation. More guards began to emerge from other stations around the compound, and Weber watched in growing horror as each one revealed the same smooth, clean-shaven face. Some carried the same buzzing devices Rodriguez had used, while others held different variations of the same impossible technology. The sound multiplied across the camp, creating a chorus of electric humming that seemed to mock everything the German prisoners had believed about their enemy. "If they can bring electric razors to a battlefield," Weber said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper, "what else do they have that we don't know about?" The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Weber thought of the reports they had received during their final patrol, intelligence briefings that described American forces as disorganized and poorly supplied. He remembered laughing with his crew about American soldiers who supposedly couldn't maintain their equipment or adapt to harsh conditions. Yet here they were, maintaining perfect grooming standards in a prisoner camp using technology that seemed to come from another century entirely. The implications crashed over Weber like the depth charges that had destroyed his submarine. If this simple morning routine revealed such a massive gap in understanding, what did it mean for everything else they thought they knew? The prisoners around him had fallen into a stunned silence, their faces reflecting the same dawning realization that was spreading through Weber's consciousness like ice water in his veins. They had not simply lost the war, they had been fighting an enemy whose true capabilities they had never even begun to comprehend. Richter moved closer to Weber, his voice barely audible. "Captain, if this is what they use for shaving, what do you think their weapons really look like?" Weber couldn't answer. He stared through the fence at the American guards, watching them go about their morning routine with the casual confidence of men who lived in a world where the impossible was merely practical. The cold morning air bit at his partially shaved face, but he felt a deeper chill spreading through his entire body. The sound of the electric razors continued to fill the air, a mechanical symphony that seemed to announce the arrival of a future the German prisoners had never imagined. Weber picked up his fallen razor from the ground, its dull blade and primitive design suddenly appearing almost medieval in comparison to what he had just witnessed. As he stood there, surrounded by his fellow prisoners and their shared silence of understanding, Weber felt the last vestiges of his old worldview crumble away. The propaganda, the intelligence reports, the confident predictions of victory, all of it reduced to dust by the simple sight of an American boy shaving with electricity in a muddy field. In that moment of silence, we understood we had not just lost the war. We had never really known who we were fighting. Lieutenant Colonel James "Mac" McCready stood frozen in the doorway of the makeshift barber shop, watching as 20 German prisoners of war pressed their faces against the chain-link fence separating them from the American quarters. Their eyes were wide with disbelief, mouths agape as if witnessing a miracle that defied everything they understood about warfare and survival. The morning sun cast long shadows across the compound, but nothing could dim the electric hum that had captured their complete attention. Inside the American section, Private Johnson moved his electric razor methodically across his jaw, completely unaware of the audience he had attracted. The small device buzzed with mechanical precision, its chrome surface gleaming in the early light. McCready felt his stomach tighten as he realized what the prisoners were seeing, not just a man shaving, but an impossible display of American abundance that contradicted every assumption about wartime rationing and resource management. "Sir, is there a problem?" Sergeant Mike O'Sullivan approached from behind, his boots crunching on the gravel path. His weathered face showed genuine confusion as he noticed MacReady's tense posture and the crowd of German prisoners gathered at the fence. MacReady turned slowly, his mind racing through the implications of what he was witnessing. "Mike, do you see what's happening over there? Those men are staring at Johnson like he's performing magic." O'Sullivan squinted toward the fence, then shrugged with the casual indifference of a man who had grown accustomed to military routine. "They're probably just curious about our grooming standards, sir." Nothing unusual about maintaining proper appearance, even in the field. But MacReady knew better. His years of military intelligence training had taught him to recognize the subtle signs of psychological impact, and what he saw in those German faces went far beyond mere curiosity. These were men who had fought across Europe, witnessed the industrial might of modern warfare, yet they stood transfixed by something as simple as an electric razor powered by a portable generator. The morning routine continued around them as more American soldiers emerged from their quarters, each carrying their own electric razor as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The German prisoners began whispering among themselves in rapid, hushed German, their voices carrying a mixture of awe and disbelief that MacReady could hear even from his position 30 yards away. "Sergeant," MacReady said, his voice dropping to match the gravity of his realization, "those men aren't amazed by our grooming standards. They're shocked that we have electricity to waste on something so trivial while fighting a war thousands of miles from home." O'Sullivan's expression shifted from confusion to understanding as the implication settled in. He had requisitioned the electric razors as standard field equipment, treating them as basic necessities rather than symbols of American technological superiority. Now, watching the prisoners' reactions, he began to comprehend the message their routine was sending to the enemy. Across the compound, Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann pressed closer to the fence, his trained scientific mind struggling to process what he was observing. As a physicist who had worked on German military projects, he understood the enormous logistical challenges of maintaining electrical power in remote field locations. Yet here were American soldiers using electricity for personal grooming, as if power were abundant and unlimited. "This is impossible," Zimmermann muttered in German to the prisoner beside him. "No army wastes electricity on razors when they need every volt for communications and weapons. Either the Americans have solved problems we cannot even imagine, or this is some elaborate deception." The other prisoner, a young infantry officer named Klaus, shook his head in bewilderment. "But why would they deceive us about razors? What military advantage could this possibly serve?" Zimmermann's eyes narrowed as he watched another American soldier plug his razor into a portable outlet connected to a humming generator. Perhaps that is exactly the point. They are showing us that their industrial capacity is so vast, they can afford to bring luxuries to war zones. This is not about razors, this is about demonstrating unlimited resources. Meanwhile, MacReady found himself caught in an impossible position. Military regulations strictly forbade sharing technical information with enemy prisoners, yet the daily routine of his men was inadvertently providing intelligence about American manufacturing capabilities and logistical sophistication. He could order his troops to stop using electric razors, but that would create suspicion and damage morale while appearing to validate enemy assumptions about American resource limitations. The psychological warfare was entirely accidental, yet potentially more effective than any planned propaganda campaign. Each morning, as his soldiers performed their routine grooming, they were unknowingly broadcasting a message of American abundance that contradicted everything the German military leadership believed about wartime economics. O'Sullivan watched MacReady's internal struggle with growing concern. "Sir, should I issue new grooming protocols? We could have the men switch to traditional razors to avoid drawing attention." MacReady considered the suggestion, then slowly shook his head. "No, Sergeant." Changing our routine now would send the wrong message to both our men and theirs. We continue as normal, but I need you to document everything. Every reaction, every conversation you overhear, every change in prisoner behavior. As the morning progressed, more German prisoners gathered at the fence, creating an unofficial observation post that monitored American activities with scientific precision. Their whispered conversations grew more animated as they struggled to reconcile what they were seeing with their understanding of wartime resource management. The situation reached a surreal climax when Private Johnson, completely oblivious to his audience, began cleaning his electric razor with a small brush while the motor still hummed. The sight of such meticulous care for a grooming device in a war zone sent visible shockwaves through the watching prisoners. McCready realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in military history, accidental psychological warfare that was more effective than deliberate propaganda because it appeared completely natural and unstaged. The German prisoners were seeing proof of American industrial might that no speech or demonstration could have conveyed as powerfully. The irony was not lost on him. While German High Command in Berlin dismissed reports of American electric weapons as impossible fairy tales, their own soldiers were witnessing daily proof of technological capabilities that exceeded their wildest imagination. The institutional blindness on both sides created a perfect storm of misunderstanding that favored American morale while undermining German confidence. As the last American soldier finished his morning routine and stored his electric razor in a regulation case, McCready turned to O'Sullivan with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting the entire scene in sharp relief, but the psychological impact would linger long after the shadows faded. We thought we were just following standard grooming procedures, but we had accidentally revealed the secret of American victory. We brought civilization to war, not war to civilization. The electric razor sparked violently in Eddie Kowalski's calloused hands, sending a shower of blue sparks across the cramped tent floor. He cursed under his breath, yanking his fingers away from the exposed wiring as the acrid smell of burning metal filled the humid night air. This was the fourth razor that had died on him this week, and tomorrow morning's inspection was less than 6 hours away. Private First Class Kowalski wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve, his Detroit-trained fingers already reaching for his father's old toolkit. The leather pouch had traveled with him from the appliance shop on 8 Mile Road to this sweltering prisoner-of-war camp somewhere in the European countryside, and now it held the key to maintaining an illusion that could determine the outcome of the war itself. "Come on, you piece of junk," he whispered, prying open the razor's chrome casing with practiced precision. The internal components were corroded beyond recognition, victims of the relentless humidity and battlefield conditions that no American engineer had anticipated when designing these symbols of technological superiority. Outside his tent, the camp lay in deceptive silence. 200 German prisoners slept fitfully in their barracks, but Kowalski knew that several pairs of eyes remained wakeful, watching for any sign that the Americans' miraculous equipment might finally fail. The psychological warfare was as real as any bullet, and he had become its most unlikely soldier. His flashlight beam revealed the extent of the damage inside the razor. The motor's copper windings had oxidized completely, and the intricate gear system that had once hummed with mechanical precision now resembled a collection of rusted scrap metal. Yet, somehow, he had to make it work again. The morning shaving ritual had become a daily demonstration of American industrial might, and Colonel Hayes had made it clear that failure was not an option. "Kowalski!" The whispered voice from outside his tent made him freeze, his heart hammering against his ribs. "You in there, son?" Colonel Robert Hayes ducked through the tent flap, his weathered face etched with the same worry that had been consuming him for weeks. The commanding officer's silver hair caught the flashlight beam as he surveyed the scattered razor parts with growing alarm. "How many are we down to?" Hayes asked, his voice barely audible above the distant sound of crickets. "Honestly, sir, this is the last working unit." Kowalski held up the mangled razor, its chrome surface dulled by countless repairs. The others are held together with prayer and wire. One more breakdown, and we're done. Hayes sank onto the camp stool beside Kowalski's makeshift workbench, suddenly looking every one of his 53 years. The weight of command had aged him visibly since they had established this camp, but the razor crisis threatened to unravel everything they had worked to achieve. "The Red Cross inspection is tomorrow," Hayes said, staring at his hands. "Dr. Muller will be watching every detail. If those German prisoners see us fumbling with broken equipment, word will spread through every POW camp in Europe within a week." Kowalski nodded grimly, understanding the stakes better than anyone. He had watched the prisoners' faces during the morning rituals, seen the mixture of awe and resentment as American guards effortlessly operated their electric razors while the Germans made do with dull manual blades. It was psychological warfare at its most subtle and effective. "There's something else, sir," Kowalski said, his voice dropping even lower. "I think one of the prisoners has been watching me work." Otto Brennan, the tall one with the engineer's eyes. He knows more about electrical systems than he's letting on. Through a gap in the tent wall, Otto Brennan pressed his eye closer to the canvas, his breath shallow as he observed the American's midnight struggle. The former electrical engineer from Munich had been watching these secret repair sessions for weeks, and each night brought new revelations about the reality behind the facade. Brennan had spent his career designing power systems for German factories, and he recognized the signs of equipment failure that Kowalski was fighting against. The Americans weren't dealing with superior technology, they were battling the same fundamental problems that had plagued German engineering throughout the war. The difference was their refusal to accept defeat. As Kowalski's steady hands rewired the razor's internal connections, Brennan found himself grudgingly impressed by the young soldier's skill. The repair technique was unorthodox but effective, using improvised materials to restore functionality to equipment that should have been discarded weeks ago. It spoke to a kind of industrial resilience that Germany had never fully developed. "The supply convoy should arrive within 48 hours, Hayes whispered, though both men knew that timeline was optimistic at best. The war had made every supply line a gamble, and replacement parts for electric razors weren't exactly high-priority cargo. Kowalski tested the rewired connections with careful precision, his father's training guiding every movement. The old man had taught him that every appliance had a personality, a unique combination of mechanical quirks that could be coaxed back to life if you understood its language. This razor had been speaking to him for weeks, and he was finally beginning to understand what it needed. The motor coughed to life with a reluctant whir, its sound rough but functional. Kowalski allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction before snapping the chrome casing back into place. Another crisis averted, another day of psychological advantage preserved. "Sir, there's something else we need to consider," Kowalski said, securing the last screw with practiced efficiency. "The prisoners are starting to imagine what other technologies we might be hiding. I've heard them whispering about radar, about new weapons, about capabilities they think we're keeping secret." Hayes raised an eyebrow, intrigued by this unexpected development. "And are we?" "Not exactly, sir. But they don't know that. Their own imagination is doing our work for us." Outside the tent, Brennan carefully retreated from his listening post, his mind racing with implications. The Americans weren't just maintaining their equipment. They were maintaining hope itself, the belief that their industrial system could overcome any obstacle through sheer determination and ingenuity. As dawn approached, Kowalski packed away his tools with the methodical care of a craftsman. Tomorrow would bring another performance, another morning when German prisoners would watch American guards demonstrate the effortless superiority of democratic technology. They would pretend not to be impressed while secretly wondering what other miracles might be hidden in the Americans' arsenal. The weight of deception pressed heavily on both men as they prepared for another day of carefully orchestrated theater. Hayes understood that he was managing more than just a prison camp. He was conducting a psychological operation that could influence enemy morale across the entire European theater of war. Every morning became a performance where we pretended our miracles were routine, while they pretended not to believe in miracles at all, Hayes murmured, watching Kowalski test the repaired razor one final time before the sun rose on another day of carefully maintained illusions. Private Rodriguez approached the barbed wire fence on Christmas morning, 1944, his boots crunching through the fresh snow that had fallen overnight. The camp was quieter than usual, with most of the American guards gathered around a makeshift Christmas tree near the main barracks. In his weathered hands, Rodriguez carried a small wooden box, its contents wrapped carefully in brown paper. Captain Klaus Weber watched from his position near the prisoners' quarters, his gray eyes following the young soldier's movements with the same wariness he had maintained for months. "Frohe Weihnachten, Captain," Rodriguez called out in heavily accented German, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Weber stepped closer to the fence, his worn uniform hanging loose on his frame after months of prison camp rations. The American soldier's face carried an expression Weber had not expected, genuine kindness mixed with something that might have been pity. "You speak German," Weber replied in English, his voice carrying the formal tone of a career military officer despite his circumstances. Rodriguez nodded, setting the box down carefully near the fence post. "My grandmother was from Munich. She taught me." He paused, studying Weber's face through the wire. "She also taught me that Christmas should be about human decency, regardless of which uniform a man wears." Weber's hands trembled slightly as he reached through the fence to accept the unexpected gift. The wrapping paper crackled under his fingers, and for a moment he hesitated. In his 23 years of military service, he had been taught that accepting anything from the enemy was a sign of weakness, a betrayal of his oath to the fatherland. But the weight of the object in his hands stirred a curiosity that overrode his military conditioning. As he unwrapped the package, Weber's world began to shift on its axis. Inside lay an electric razor, its chrome surface gleaming despite the overcast sky. The device felt substantial in his hands, well-constructed and obviously new. Weber stared at it, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. According to every briefing he had received, every intelligence report he had read, the Americans were barely capable of producing adequate weapons, let alone luxury items like this. "How is this possible?" Weber whispered, more to himself than to Rodriguez. The young American soldier's expression grew somber. "Captain, where I come from in Detroit, these roll off the assembly line every day. My father works at the plant that makes them. They've been producing thousands of these every week since before the war started." Rodriguez's voice carried no boasting, only a quiet sadness. "The same factories that make these also make aircraft engines and tank parts. We switch between them depending on what's needed." Weber's hands began to shake more violently as the implications crashed over him like artillery shells. Every report he had received from Berlin had insisted that American industrial capacity was limited, that their factories were primitive, that their technology was inferior to German engineering. Yet here in his hands was proof of a manufacturing capability so advanced that it could produce luxury consumer goods while simultaneously fighting a war on multiple continents. Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann emerged from the prisoner's barracks, his medical bag in hand and his keen eyes immediately focusing on the scene at the fence. The camp's unofficial historian had been documenting everything he witnessed, keeping detailed notes hidden beneath his mattress. He approached Weber slowly, recognizing the profound transformation occurring in his fellow officer's mind. "Klaus," Zimmermann said softly, using the captain's first name for the first time since their capture. "What have you discovered?" Weber held up the electric razor with trembling hands. "Heinrich, they mass-produce these. While we were told they could barely make rifles, they were manufacturing electric devices for personal grooming and distributing them to their soldiers as routine equipment." His voice cracked with the weight of revelation. "What else have we been lied to about?" Zimmerman took the device and examined it carefully, his practiced medical hands exploring its construction. The precision of the engineering was undeniable. Smooth surfaces, perfectly aligned components, and materials that spoke of industrial processes far beyond anything he had imagined America possessed. "This changes everything we thought we knew," he murmured. Corporal David Goldstein, the camp's primary translator, had been observing the exchange from his position near the guard tower. As the son of immigrants who had fled Germany 20 years earlier, he understood both languages perfectly and had been watching Weber's psychological journey with professional interest. The moment he witnessed was one military psychologists would later study, the precise instant when a career soldier's worldview collapsed entirely. Goldstein approached the fence, his young face carrying the weight of knowledge that extended far beyond his years. "Captain Weber," he said in perfect German, "would you like me to show you how it works?" Weber nodded mutely, his eyes never leaving the device in his hands. Goldstein produced a small electrical cord from his pocket and plugged it into a portable generator that had been set up near the fence for the camp's Christmas festivities. The razor came to life with a quiet, efficient humming sound that seemed impossibly sophisticated to Weber's ears. "The Americans have been using these since before the war," Goldstein explained, his voice gentle but firm. "Every barber shop, every home, every military base. Electricity is so common in America that they consider this a basic necessity, not a luxury." He paused, allowing the information to sink in. "Captain, the industrial capacity required to produce these for civilian use while simultaneously building the largest military force in history. It's beyond what any of your intelligence reports suggested, isn't it?" Weber's face underwent a transformation that Goldstein would remember for the rest of his life. The captain's military bearing, maintained through months of imprisonment, finally crumbled. His shoulders sagged, his jaw went slack, and his eyes filled with a mixture of wonder and despair that spoke of a man confronting the complete failure of everything he had believed. Meanwhile, in Berlin, intelligence officers continued to file reports dismissing what they termed American electric razor propaganda as psychological warfare too absurd to be credible. Colonel Friedrich Brenner stood before a map of Europe, red pins marking German positions that grew fewer each day, while his subordinates assured him that American claims of technological superiority were nothing more than elaborate deception. "Herr Colonel," reported Major Hans Kessler, reading from a decoded transmission, "our agents in the field continue to send reports about American electrical devices being used in combat zones. They claim to have witnessed everything from portable radios to battery-powered lighting systems." Kessler's voice carried the skepticism that had become standard in German intelligence circles. "Clearly, these are fabricated stories designed to undermine morale." Brenner nodded approvingly, unaware that at that very moment his nephew Klaus Weber was holding irrefutable proof that every assumption the German High Command had made about American capabilities was catastrophically wrong. Back at the prison camp, Lieutenant Colonel Macready received a priority message from Washington. The military psychologists studying the Razor program had reported unprecedented success in breaking down enemy resistance without violence or torture. The simple act of demonstrating American industrial superiority through everyday objects was proving more effective than months of conventional interrogation. "Expand the program to all camps," the message read. "Distribute electric razors, portable radios, and other consumer goods to demonstrate American technological advantage. Focus on career officers and technical personnel who can appreciate the industrial implications." Macready folded the message and walked toward the fence where Weber still stood, the electric razor humming softly in his weathered hands. The American colonel had fought through 3 campaigns and witnessed countless moments of victory and defeat, but he recognized that what was happening here represented something different, the quiet collapse of an entire ideology through the simple demonstration of technological reality. Weber began to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Corporal Goldstein, would you be willing to teach me English? Not military English, proper English, the kind I will need to understand the world that will exist after this war ends." Goldstein nodded solemnly. "It would be my honor, Captain." As the days passed, the sound of electric razors became a constant presence in the camp. German prisoners lined up each morning not just for the privilege of a proper shave, but for the daily reminder of the civilization they had been fighting against. The quiet humming sound replaced the martial songs that had once echoed through the barracks, becoming what Weber privately called the soundtrack of German defeat. The revelation spread among the prisoners like a contagion of despair and awakening. Men who had believed they were fighting for a technologically superior nation found themselves confronting the reality that they had been facing an opponent so advanced that it could afford to waste resources on the comfort of its enemies. Weber's transformation continued over the following weeks. He began teaching English to his fellow prisoners, but more importantly, he began helping them prepare psychologically for a post-war world where everything they thought they knew about America would need to be reconsidered. The electric razor had become more than a grooming tool. It was a symbol of their complete misunderstanding of the enemy they had been fighting. One evening, as Weber sat in his bunk running his fingers over the smooth chrome surface of the device that had changed everything, he spoke to the silence of the barracks. His voice carried the weight of a man who had lost not just a war, but his entire understanding of the world. "When I finally shaved with that American razor, I felt my beard disappear, but I also felt the last of my faith in the fatherland slip away with every electric stroke." Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights themes of innovation, modernization, and the awe of technological progress even amid war. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke reflection, and inspire appreciation for human ingenuity and the advancements that reshape history.